assessing Pliny the Younger and the weakness of his testimony for an historical Jesus. Pliny the Younger's letter to Emperor Trajan, written around 112 CE, is commonly understood as the earliest non-Christian reference to Jesus if we remove Josephus' now indisputably fake testimony. However, a closer examination reveals that it provides little, if any, support for the historicity of Jesus. Rather than serving as an independent confirmation, Pliny's testimony is vague, lacks any biographical details about Jesus, and raises serious questions about how widespread Christianity actually was at this time. The Pliny reference. Pliny, while serving as governor of Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, wrote to Emperor Trajan seeking advice on how to deal with Christians in his province. The two key passages from his letter state, "They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ." They affirmed the whole of their guilt to their error was that they met on a stated day before it was light and addressed a form of prayer to Christ as to a divinity. But all I could discover was evidence of an absurd and extravagant superstition. Pliny's letter does not clearly reference Jesus as an historical figure, nor does it provide any details about his life, crucifixion, or supposed resurrection. Instead, it merely acknowledges the existence of people worshipping someone called Christ as a deity, a practice that could just as easily reflect belief in a celestial or mythical Christ rather than an historical teacher from Galilee. Pliny's ignorance of Christianity. Richard Carrier notes a critical issue with Pliny's testimony. He, Pliny, had also been a lawyer in Roman courts for several decades, then served in Rome as praetor, the ancient equivalent of both chief of police and attorney general, and then served as one of Trajan's top legal advisors for several years before he was appointed to govern Bithynia. And yet he tells us he had never attended a trial of Christians and knew nothing of what they believed or what crimes they were guilty of. Given Pliny's legal and political background, it is striking that he had never encountered Christianity before this time. If Christianity had been a significant movement in the 1st century, particularly under Nero's supposed persecution in the 60s CE, it is hard to believe that Pliny would be completely unfamiliar with it. His lack of knowledge strongly suggests that Christianity was still a minor and obscure sect even in the early 2nd century. A late and unreliable attestation. David Fitzgerald further emphasizes Pliny's unfamiliarity with Christians. It's significant that Pliny had never heard of Christians. Before becoming governor, Pliny had spent several decades as a lawyer in Rome, then served as praetor, the ancient equivalent of both chief of police and attorney general, the consul, the highest possible office in the entire Roman Empire, second only to the emperor himself, and then one of Trajan's top legal advisors for several years before he was appointed governor of Bithynia. Despite all this experience, he says he knew nothing of this fringe group. He had never attended a trial of Christians and was completely unaware of their beliefs or what crimes they were guilty of. Elegant proof that Christians were socially invisible up to this point. Incidentally, Pliny the Younger's complete lack of knowledge also about Christians also confirms that his father, Pliny the Elder, never discussed Christians in his eyewitness account, now lost, of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which devotes an entire volume to that year. If he had made mention of them, Pliny the Younger, his devoted admirer, nephew, and adopted son, would not have known nothing about Christians, as he tells Trajan. If Christianity had been growing significantly throughout the 1st century, particularly if it had experienced widespread persecution under Nero, it is inexplicable that someone as well connected as Pliny would be completely unaware of it until encountering the sect in Bithynia. a celestial, non-historical Christ? The ambiguity in Pliny's letter is further compounded by the way he describes Christian practices. As Raphael Latasta points out, praying to what seems to be a divine Christ or any other activity directed towards such a Christ says nothing of whether Christ existed or not, any more than worshipping a God person in any other religion would prove the existence of that God person. Pliny's description of Christians worshipping Christ as to a divinity aligns with early Christian literature, such as Paul's letters, where Jesus is often portrayed as a celestial figure rather than an historical individual. There is no indication that Pliny knew of any specific historical figure named Jesus, only that some individuals revered a being called Christ. Christianity's supposed growth, a myth. Pliny's letter suggests that Christianity was not well understood even by Roman officials, despite claims by later Christian tradition that it had spread widely by this time. If we are to believe Acts and Paul's letters, there were Christian communities in major cities like Ephesus and Galatia by the mid-1st century. Bithynia, where Pliny was stationed, was relatively close to these regions, yet he speaks of Christianity as something unfamiliar and new. This suggests that Christianity was still a minor sect, likely fragmented and inconsistent in its beliefs. The notion that Christianity had become a major force requiring active Roman suppression in the 1st century does not align with Pliny's account. No mention of Christ's life, death, or resurrection. One of the most glaring issues with Pliny's letter is that despite discussing Christian beliefs and practices, it makes no mention of Jesus' life, teachings, crucifixion, or resurrection. This silence is significant because if Jesus had been a well-known historical figure, it would be natural for Pliny to mention some details about him. Instead, all we find is vague reference to a Christ being worshipped, a title, not a name. Pliny the Elder's silence. Adding further weight to this issue is the complete silence of Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger's uncle and adopted father, who lived through the period of Nero's supposed persecution of Christians and wrote extensive histories, none of which mention Jesus or Christians. If Christians had been a significant enough movement in the 60s CE to be persecuted by Nero, why does Pliny the Elder not mention them at all? Conclusion. A weak and indirect testimony. Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan is often cited as crucial evidence for early Christianity, but it ultimately tells us very little. It does not mention Jesus as an historical figure, nor does it provide any independent confirmation of gospel events. Instead, it reflects an official encountering a sect he does not fully understand, referring only to vague notions of worship directed at a Christ. Furthermore, Pliny's ignorance of Christianity combined with his father's complete silence strongly suggests that Christianity remained obscure and insignificant well into the 2nd century. If anything, his letter supports the idea that Christianity was still in its formative stages, with no clear biographical tradition about Jesus circulating in mainstream Roman discourses. For those seeking external independent verification of Jesus' existence, Pliny the Younger's testimony provides no solid ground.